Hey guys, it's Ping. We are here at Fox Raceway today for Vital MX's ride on the KTM 22.5 Factory Edition 450. Been a long awaited. You've seen the launch of this bike. This is our first chance getting a ride on it and giving you our first impression. This thing is new from the ground up. There's a lot of new stuff in here, so let's just get started. From the outside in here, all of the plastics, the bodywork, completely redesigned. If you take a look at the front fender, it's got a completely different shape, designed a little bit wider in the front to catch some mud. People were complaining that mud was making its way past that and hitting the rider in the goggles. On the back side of the fender, there's some fins cut into there to, again, block mud from the back of the tire while increasing airflow. The radiator shrouds, you'll notice these, very long and pointy, but they increase the cooling of the bike significantly, they found during their testing and development. There's also some texture on the outside edges, so if you're putting your foot up through a rut, you can actually set your leg on that and it'll kind of hold it, give you some texture. So there's a lot of design elements in the plastics that are not just for looks, there's actually some functionality to it. As you get to the back, the tank's a little bit bigger, actually slightly bigger. Then as you get to the side plates, you'll see that there's holes on either side. This goes all the way through. And it was basically just to channel airflow. Prior to this design, it was kind of coming from all different places. There wasn't a specific air path. And they basically wanted to create a specific flow path. So they've done that with that setup on the side plate. So that's the plastic side of it, all right? The seat comes with a gripper seat. We've seen these before, very cool. This is an all new WP setup, different valving. The fork is the same externally. So if you have some cone valve forks, you can mount them in there, they will fit. However, the track shock will not fit. The shock on this bike is a little bit shorter, about 20 mil. It's just designed basically because there's a frame change that allows them to mount it in a different position. So the shock is shorter. So you won't be able to use old track shocks. And another feature on this suspension, all of the adjustments are now toolless. So high speed, low speed compression, rebound, compression, rebound on the fork, all adjustable with just your fingers. This is super cool when you're out at the track and just want to kind of fine tune and tweak it. You don't have to run back to the pits and grab any kind of tools, just pull over, reach down and do it. So moving on to the frame, again, all new frame, designed to increase torsional rigidity without giving up any lateral or other type of flex that they want. And it does have, it's hard to explain. If you click the link to the video that we have that was basically the breakdown of everything they did to this bike at the launch. And you can see all the specs. There's changes to the frame and the backbone where this shock mounts. And it allows them to, again, get those flex characteristics they want. That allowed them to change the shock, the way it was shaped and things like that. The subframe, again now, is same as you're gonna see on the Husqvarna and the other models. It's aluminum at the bottom and a composite in the rear. And the reason for that is, down at the bottom where it mounts, it needed to be aluminum so it doesn't break, but that composite allows it to kind of flex and give several inches in either direction. So if you fall, instead of bending the subframe and having it permanently cocked over, it'll return to its shape. So very cool design. Also gives you a little bit of flex in the back of the bike. All new swing arm design, went to a smaller axle in the rear. So stiffer subframe, smaller axle, gets a little bit more flex back there, more rigidity in that swing arm. And then they also took the engine and tilted it back a couple of degrees. And what that does is just those little movements will change the characteristic of the bike, but it also changes the position of where that countershaft sprocket is so that the angle of the chain as it comes off the rear sprocket and up over the counter now becomes a little flatter. And that just allows it to work better, doesn't bind up so much, lets it work a little more freely. These are all just small little tweaks that they'll test and develop in R&D and find that most people like that better. The wheels and brakes, I believe, are pretty much the same. I think those are a couple of the only things that didn't get completely revised in this model. Again, in the engine, they made it smaller yet again, even a smaller head, bigger cam cover, which is all magnesium, so weight reduction there. I don't think there's massive weight savings on this bike because where they took some weight off in certain areas like the shock and the engine, they added some in other places to kind of beef it up. So I think it's generally a wash. If it's lighter, it's minimal. There's a whole new set of fobs up on the bars too. So on the right side, you've got the on and off switch in one fob. I like that. Just everything's in one place, super convenient. Then on the left side, you have two different maps again. And these are two large buttons, very easy to hit. You can use them on the fly. You don't have to pull over, be in neutral, or any of that stuff. Map 1, map 2. Map 1 is, one of the things they wanted to do with the mapping this year was create a bigger separation between the two maps. Years past, it was a very subtle difference between the two, and they wanted to kind of spread that gap out so it was very noticeable. And it is. We'll get to the performance here in a minute, but Map 1 is a little bit torquier off the bottom and a little more, I guess, aggressive off the bottom is what they're looking for. And the next one, a little softer off the bottom, stronger middle and top. So just kind of depending on the type of riding you're doing. So below Map 1 and Map 2, you have traction control. This is a tool we've seen in the past. Works really well when conditions are dry slick or wet slick. And it just keeps you from really breaking that back end loose violently. It sort of corrects your mistakes a little bit. It's subtle, but it's noticeable and very cool. And I highly recommend you play with that and get comfortable with it. If it's sticky, ruddy, even sand, you're probably not gonna like it, won't notice it. But when it does, the traction goes away a little bit. It's a really neat tool. The new thing on this fob is there's a quick shift button. This is a technology that they brought over from road racing. This is pretty common for, well over a decade. Most road race teams have been using this, where it senses in the shift drum when you start to put pressure on it, it cuts the ignition for a second, takes the load off of it and allows you to shift into the next gear. You can imagine in road racing where traction is nearly 100%, there's always a load on the engine. And so to let off the throttle or to pull the clutch in to allow it to shift, you really upset the chassis. It's very accentuated on that pavement. So for them, this is something they developed a long time ago. So where if you're going around a sweeper, you can just bang gears and it'll stay in a nice steady park. It doesn't upset the chassis. So they brought that over to motocross. Imagine if you're in a start and the start's tilled really deep and you got a heavy load on that engine, it's tough to get them to shift sometimes. So with this, as soon as it senses pressure on the shift lever, and it has to be purposeful. If, I was worried maybe if you just touched it, it would pop out of gear. It's not like that. You gotta shift it. But it cuts the ignition for a second. You can hear it kind of dip down and it'll shift. The foot pegs. So the foot peg mount position is further in, which just keeps them from getting packed full of dirt or anything. And then the foot peg itself is wider, and it's a different design, a really cool platform with some, I would say, some grabbier teeth. And it just gives you a better platform. In bikes past, especially if you wear knee braces, I found your foot actually sits about halfway off the peg and you've only got half your foot on it. So now they made those pegs a little wider and it's a much better platform. Huge improvement for KTM. Like I said, there's a whole lot of new stuff for this. I would go back and watch the launch video if this is something you're really into to get all the specs and the little details, because there's so much to it. But let's talk about performance on the track. My first impression, the front fender is definitely different looking. It's kind of wide. I thought, oh man, that's weird. It's gonna throw me off. I didn't notice it once I got on the track, but it is odd looking, I guess from what I'm used to KTM front fenders. I noticed a couple things right away. It's pretty firm. I'm at 170 pounds. It's probably set up for 185, 190 is my guess, 200. So depending on what your weight is, you can adjust it and get it to work fine. By the end of the day, I had it pretty dialed in. We just softened it up a bit. SAG's recommended at 105. And I just use standard air pressure, what they recommend. So I just opened compression on the fork, a couple clicks, half turn on the high speed out, 2 clicks out on the low speed compression, 1 slower in the shock and the rear end rebound, and I was pretty happy for the day. I went through the 2 maps, and map 1 to me was awesome. Very rideable, controllable. It does have a noticeable pickup on the bottom that I didn't feel last year. Last year was a little soft off the bottom, which you may or may not like depending on your riding style. To me, I like the little bit more aggressive pickup, but then it's a nice, smooth, linear power for the rest of the power curve. Map 2, way more aggressive. While the bottom, I didn't notice too much of a difference. When this thing gets to the middle, man, it is going. This thing is so fast, and I just found it was too much for me. 450s have a ton of power anyway. Maybe if I was at elevation in the sand, something like that, I could see using it. Cool to have it, or if you're a really fast rider or a really big guy and you want that extra juice, it's there. You will not need to put an exhaust or piston or any other high performance parts in this bike. It makes all the horsepower you will need. Trust me on that. I played with traction control. Again, we had really good traction today, so it wasn't really noticeable. I still like it on because I don't feel any downside to it. And when I do get into a slick spot, I notice it helped me. So if you are unsure about that, go out one time with it on, turn it off, just get comfortable with it. We talked about the rapid shifting a little bit. And for me, I liked it on the start because if I'm, typically you're very loaded. Occasionally, like if your left foot, to balance, you got to put your left foot out. sometimes you don't get back to that shifter until you're wound out pretty good and you've got a heavy load on the motor. This tool allows you, even if it's wound really tight, you can make that shift without having to let off or pull the clutch in. So I really did like it for the start. I thought with some practice I'd get really comfortable with it, but I tend to make shifts on the track at the face of obstacles or in places where I wouldn't want the power to cut like that. So I'm not convinced I would love it on the track, but the button is so accessible, you could definitely do a start with it, you know, and then when you got to the first jump on the track, just reach down and tap it, or if you had a slow corner, you could reach down and just push the button and turn it off. Neat tool. I expect to see this thing develop over time and become more and more useful and user-friendly. Like I said, by the end of the day, I had the suspension working great, no issues whatsoever. I went quite a bit softer, but there's still more room to go. If I wanted to go softer, I could soften it up quite a bit, but it was stable, no issues. Thing turns really well. I didn't have any problems whatsoever there. And like I said, all the horsepower in the world. The brakes are still top level. And one thing I really like about the KTM is the ability to adjust your levers in and out, the clutch and brake. It's just a simple dial. And you know, I find a lot of times on a lot of bikes, I've got to really reach for the brake or clutch. And sometimes you can adjust the front brake on some models, but the clutch, if it's a cable, typically can't. So I really like that, the adjustability for this. It also comes with rubber mounted handlebars, you know, handlebar mounts. You can take that off if you don't like it, but for me, I found it really reduces vibration. There wasn't anything about this bike I didn't really like. I will say this, it does feel a little bit taller and like a little bit bigger motorcycle. So if you're a guy who maybe like me is a little shorter, you just may have to work a little bit on setup. Maybe add a little more sag, open up your high-speed compression a touch just to get to settle. Maybe slide the forks up in the clamps a couple mil, that kind of thing. But like I said, on the track, it was super comfortable. I just found myself teeter-tottering in the pits on it a little bit. It's a little bit tall. Or a low seat would help, anything like that. But I love the foot pegs. I love the changes they made to the chassis. To me, it felt like it would still turn, carve around the inside, like KTMs have been really good at in the past several years. But I didn't lose any high speed stability. You know, their motto is ready to race. And honestly, this is the most accurate depiction of that model. You will literally not need to put anything on this bike. Set it up for yourself and go racing. It is that good. They've really paid attention to detail. And I encourage you to go down to a KTM dealer and just walk around it and take a good look. Everything from the chain guide, the way it sits flush with the swing arm now, so there's no rocks or mud that can get jammed in there. They've just really thought everything through, and you can see the influence from the race team, guys like Roger DeCoster, who just really pay attention to those details. And it's really shown through on this bike. So kudos to these guys, incredible motorcycle. Thank you for having us out, KTM. I appreciate you guys watching, and stay tuned for more videos.